Episode 50 of the Vincast is merely weeks away, and you, the listener, can get involved with the podcast and actually be on the show. It's an opportunity for listeners to share their own wine stories and experiences, share their impressions of the podcast, or even ask myself, the intrepid wino, aka James Scaresbrook, any questions you might want to ask about me or about wine in general. So all you need to do is email me at thevincast@gmail.com, or come to intrepidwino.com, send me a message there, or even on social media, get in contact, because then I can liaise a time that you can link up via Skype and be on the podcast. Only weeks away, so do get in quick. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome back to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and I do hope you enjoyed last week's episode with Nathan Earl. And if you did, that you then went and watched every episode of Plonk on YouTube, and you also possibly attending one of the Wine Communicators of Australia seminars, where all three of the stars of the show will actually be talking about the making of the show and how it can help improve the image of Australian wine. Now, for this week, I actually contacted someone I met a few years ago via Twitter, I think it was. His name is Damien Wilson, and he actually has a PhD in wine marketing. And I thought it would be an interesting opportunity to talk about the academic side of wine business studies. Obviously, with previous guests, winemakers, they've talked about their experiences studying winemaking, but myself included, there are people who actually study at an academic level wine business and wine marketing. So I had Damien call in from Burgundy, Dijon, in fact, where he actually is teaching wine marketing to future wine business professionals. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Please do get in contact with us if you did, and I will see you on the other side. Damien, thank you for joining me all the way from Burgundy. I think it's pretty early in the morning. It's the end of the day for me here, but thank you very much for making some time.
Oh, thanks very much, James. And from your perspective, I know it's the end of the day on a Friday. It's very kind of you to stick around, even though I've just come in. I'm drinking my coffee and sitting in my office and eating quite possibly the best croissant in the world. So look, I'm very happy to join you.
So tell me, Damien, as far as your kind of first introduction to wine, what was it? Where were you in your life, contextually, I guess, when you first kind of noticed that wine had a little bit more to offer you, and thought about kind of pursuing that as far as a career?
I think for me, everything started back when I was surprising. I was about 4 years old, and this wasn't a wine-based thing, but it was an interest in gastronomy, in essence. I remember being a young boy at home watching TV, and I remember seeing Bernard King make a cake on daytime TV, and I remember thinking, "Wow, what this guy's done is amazing." And I remember telling my parents that I wanted to be a chef, and they never really got into that, because they always thought that you wanted to do something which earned money, and back in those days, chefs didn't earn a great deal of money, I think, except maybe the best, and so they wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer. But it planted the seed for me, and so when as I grew older, I recognised that my parents entertained a lot. And they used to have parties, and Mum would always drink wine, Dad would always drink beer. But it was fascinating that whenever Dad would ask for beer, he'd always just ask for a colour of the can, whereas Mum would always ask for something to do with a grape variety or a brand, or it might just be the colour of the box or something like that. But or the style of wine. But she always asked for something in a far more, I guess, complex and technical way than Dad's a simple a request for a beer by colour. So it got me interested, I think, and that's pretty much where the seed of interest came in for wine. It was something fascinating for me because of its complexity, and there was I wanted to understand a bit more about that, being a curious young lad that I was.
It's funny, like I always remember my parents drinking wine, and again, I guess this is going back to the Chateau Cardboard days. By the time I think I was a teenager, they had graduated to bottles. But it wasn't until I started working in liquor retail and started learning a little bit about wine that I really started to go, oh, okay, they're different grape varieties. So Shiraz, Merlot, they're different grape varieties. They're going to have a different kind of taste, that kind of thing. And that was when I was like 20.
Mm.
So my introduction to wine came quite late. So you clearly from your mum kind of got that appreciation for differences between wine, which I guess most people would just break down to white wine, red wine, sparkling wine, and maybe sweet wine.
Yeah, it was. Mum was always clear. She never wanted something sweet. She'd always say, "No, don't get the Moselle, Damien." I mean, if that, that was if there were ever more than one box in the fridge, which didn't happen too often. So there was always this focus by Mum to say she liked a dry white. That was what Mum was interested in. So I kind of picked up on that, and then as a teenager, my parents bought a convenience store when I was living in Darwin, and of course, believing that a convenience store was the best way to make money because people always needed to buy things outside of hours. And so I was fascinated by the fact that at this store, I wasn't fascinated by the fact you could sell alcohol, but again, there was that common approach. When people would come in and ask for beer, they'd ask for a slab of cans by the colour, whereas if they wanted wine, you could see this blank look come across their face, and they go, "Oh, what have you got in wine?" And it was invariably you had to go through a process of explaining to them what you had. So I could see that there was an avenue to try and engage people if you were dealing with wine, whereas beer, people sort of came in with a clear idea what they wanted, and the sales process was much more about just providing them what they knew they wanted instead of helping them with the decision process. And I think I've always been a bit of a people person, and that experience was one of the key elements which made me realise that I wanted to get into the wine sector on the business side.
So what sort of work did you do when you sort of, I guess, in your teens or in your, how did you kind of support your socializing, your social life, I guess?
Oh, it was that was a bit more difficult. I think as you probably had the same experience, James. As soon as you get bitten by the wine bug, you start. It's no longer enough just to drink a basic cheap shadow cardboard. You start searching for the holy grail of hedonic wine experiences, and so it ends up being that progression. You'll start with something white and dry, and then you start drinking reds and sparklings. And then you start drinking, by different degrees of dryness. You discover new styles, you discover new regions, new producers, wine, and all of a sudden your interest just grows. And for me, that happened after, I think, the experience with my parents. Unfortunately, their store went bankrupt. So it taught me a couple of things. One, that you can't just rely on a good idea to be successful in business. But the most important thing was that, without the provision of service, people aren't prepared to pay extra money for something. So I then went into the service industry. I started off in retail. I think, like a lot of us, I'm working as a cash jockey at at Woolworths, and then got drawn into the service industry and started working as a commie waiter, and then working in bars, restaurants, hotels, managing from the service roles to plate carrying, and also started off my chef's apprenticeship. So I was kind of trying to get into the whole food and service industry, and working in a number of places in a number of parts of the country for almost 10 years. I felt that I had a really good idea about what people were into in wine and what to get into, and it was really the only way I could support my habit, because when you were interested in wine, you're constantly spending a lot of money on something new. You're wanting to go to wine tastings all the time, and it's all really exciting, but it's very difficult to afford unless you've either got a wealthy family or some sort of wealthy benefactor, or you've got the capacity to have a high-paying job, which generally requires academic qualifications. And after 10 years of progressing but not being able to get above the unqualified glass ceiling, I decided I was going to go back and do some studies. I wanted to do this professionally and in a serious manner, and so I applied to the Uni of Adelaide to do the diploma in wine marketing at Wake. Sorry, no, it wasn't at Wake campus. It was at Roseworthy at that stage, back in the mid '90s. So it was a conscious decision that I could see things needed to be done in the wine sector. people were petrified. The trade were far more interested in their own wine knowledge than the interests of the consumer. And I just thought that things such as education needed to be provided for the trade, not for the consumer, to help them understand what consumers were getting into. So that led me back into my studies in the mid 1990s.
So you hadn't done any further studies after school?
No, in fact, I failed year 12. So I was in this situation where
my dad didn't even make it there.
No,
and he went back and got a law commerce degree, has been working as a lawyer for most of my life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, after working for 10 years, I realized that I couldn't get back into, I couldn't really get to where I wanted to go. I wanted to be in a position of authority and to have some influence over bringing people into the wine sector who could help the wine sector develop. And I didn't think that was through wine knowledge, which is what people who are fascinated by wine want. They essentially end up fighting over the level of qualification they want, whether it's WSET or a CSW, or focusing on trying to get them some sort of technical qualification in wine knowledge. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face, because it's alienating the wine trade from the wine consumer, because the wine consumer is generally, the growth in wine consumption has generally been with the increase in new consumers coming into the category. And the more knowledgeable you are in wine, the more difficult it is for you to relate to someone who knows nothing about it or who knows very little about it. So I wanted to make that change. So I went back to education. I went back to the University of Adelaide to start my diploma in wine marketing, and I was very lucky. I had great mentors and lecturers there. I mean, I was there at the time of Professor Larry Lockshin, and there was Hugh McClellan, who was running the ship at that stage as well. I mean, it was a good group of people who had a common focus on what they wanted their graduates to achieve. And I actually
certainly during that boom period for the Australian wine industry in general.
Yeah.
There was a lot of interest as wine was growing as an industry, both domestically, and markets overseas as well. There would have been a lot of interest and a push to kind of be educating, future wine marketers, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the problems we faced in the 90s is that while the rest of the world was suffering, consumption was going down the toilet. Australia was growing and our export markets were booming. So there wasn't really a great focus on how this happened, or what we needed to do about it. We were so madly just trying to get supply into the market. So we were actively trying to get more wine makers, and to get our wine into the market, we believed we needed the credibility of wine knowledge. So having people who are going counter to that perspective, saying you need to focus on the interests of the consumer, you need to have a long-term focus, like Larry and Hugh. They were great mentors to help people get focused on what needed to be done. And I still remember one of the most valuable lessons I had in class, and it was in 1997 in a class on wine marketing with Larry. And I remember him starting off the lecture, and I think like a lot of young punks who start off with the wine business. And I came in, believing I needed to know everything about, the Grand Cru Classe. I needed to know my first from second, third, fourth, and fifth growths. I needed to know the iconic, cult producers who are coming up all around the world, because that was fascinating stuff to me. And I remember Larry talking about using a case study and introducing Jacob's Creek. And I made some pejorative remark about the brand, going, why would you drink that? And he very quickly jumped on me. He pointed at me and he said, that's the attitude that is going to spoil the future of the Australian wine sector. And, he went on to explain why. And he said, here's where all the growth is. And people who are enthusiasts, they look down their nose at them, at the big brands like Yellowtail and Jacob's Creek, and yet they're the ones who have successfully brought people into the category. What we don't know, and what we've been really poor at doing, is getting them from entering the category and trading up. Some people do. We don't specifically know why or how or at what stage it happens, but at some point, some people go from being kind of the novice entry-level consumer into being really involved into wine, and we haven't done that bit well. So that's essentially what
it's really interesting. Goal. It's really interesting because I of course went through a similar program with Adelaide University. I guess about 15 years later. Sorry if I'm making you feel old there, but. that was at the point where the Australian wine segment, the Australian wine industry had been suffering a lot. There was the combining factors of Australian dollar being very strong, making prices a lot higher, and then the global financial crisis, meaning that consumption in general, at least spending on wine in general, had gone down. And so that was where they were kind of going, we've put too much focus on the sort of the of the kind of the value or the price structure. How do we try and educate, particularly the export markets, that Australia actually makes very high quality, regionally focused wines. And so it's funny that even then there was discussion about that, and that was in the mid to late 90s.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, I think we need to work on improving the image of Australian wine. I mean, that's there's no doubt there at all, and that it's not an easy challenge to master. The problem is we've got to be careful not to kill the golden goose at the same time. We've done a lot. We've got iconic brands. I mean, you go anywhere around the world, and brands like Yellowtail and Jacob's Creek are known. Whether we as professionals like them or drink them regularly isn't the point. They're the things that have got people into the category. How we get people to trade up is really a more difficult question. And I think part of the problem with the approach we're taking is that we're focusing on the interests of the professionals. We're not looking at those people who are coming through into that category. And by doing that, we're listening to the advice that the professionals are telling us, which may not be reflective of what's happening in the market. So I think the intention,
and they're not connected with the the newer consumers. There is a disconnect between the opinion leaders, I guess, and the people entering into wine consumption.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's the real problem. I mean, you've got, Joe Public comes into wine, and I mean, this is a classic scenario which you've probably come across yourself. Joe Public comes in, you meet him or her at a wine tasting, and they go, wow. They've just discovered wine. They go, wow, this is great stuff. It's really sweet. And some smart arc will turn around and generally trying to be nice about it will say, no, that's fruity. Sweetness is different. This wine's very fruity. And I mean, if you've got
the classic one, you can't smell sweetness.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any of these sorts of things, and they're well-meaning, but the problem is that Joe Public has just come in and might have just discovered wine and has neither the experience nor the knowledge nor the interest at this stage in a category they're just discovering. They're wanting to kind of put their feet in and see how much fun it can be. It's like starting a new sport or starting a new language or anything. If you get chastised heavily at the start, you just get dissuaded. Whereas if you've had enough time to sort of get into it, you get a feel for it, you have some experiences, and you get a few early wins. Like you have a friend who will kind of go, wow, you really do know, or you like your wine. Your confidence is built up to a point that you can take a bit of a shellacking. But if you're at an event like this, and your first couple of phrases you say, and people are very quick to correct you, you lose interest in it because you just you think, hang on, this is all too hard. I thought wine was just about enjoyment and fun. And there's a lot around that particular idea, getting people interested in it. And what happens is that those people will then go off and they'll continue to drink wine occasionally, but they don't put any time or investment into it. They'll just drink wine that's given to them instead of actively looking for stuff. So what we need to do is be far more embracing for those newer consumers. And the problem with the wine trade is that because it's very competitive, there's not much money in it. People who are in it are adamant that they are the ones who have the best palates or the best knowledge or the best future or should be listened to. People they have a lot of trouble taking those blinkers off, and so it ends up being incredibly competitive. So the newer consumer comes in, sees something complex, difficult to appreciate, using the wrong language, far too difficult. Oh, hell, I'm going to go off and drink craft beer instead. No one ever gives me grief about that. So we just need to be far more. We need to change our mindsets and get people more interested in wine. And I mean, I was lucky when I got chastised in that experience from Larry in my studies. I remember thinking, gosh, I mean, he's onto something here. We really do. We're far too busy fighting amongst ourselves, and I'm not encouraging new consumers to come in, and we tell them they have to be educated. Well, if I'm interested in something and I've taken the time to get in to build up my confidence and experience, if you tell me I need to be educated, I'll take that on as a challenge. But if I'm just starting and you say you need an education to get interested in this, to be taken seriously in this category, it just ends up being too hard, because you can have a hobby in something and a hobby builds on to something bigger when you start trying to get better at it. But you need to enjoy it first before you have to start learning about it. So we've got to get back to a bit of that enjoyment stuff, I reckon, James.
I think one of the biggest problems that we have is that people so easily confuse aspiration with elitism. And so, we all think of wine as an aspirational product, and it is to a large degree. Even if you're just looking at that wine, you aspire to drink wine more than you might beer, for example. But where particularly people in the industry and to a certain extent the media maybe are kind of getting a little bit lost is they're setting wine up as an elite product, or people who drink wine as elitist, or they are the elite, and that requires a level of experience and knowledge and I guess gross or disposable income to be able to afford what we would consider to be better quality wines, whereas most people are quite happy in an aspirational way to drink wine and to maybe drink drier wines rather than sweeter wines, if there is a perception that dry wine is better quality. But they don't necessarily need to go beyond that, and I think that's where wine education, just on a between industry and consumer, there's going to be a little bit of breakdown in communication.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because we've known for the better part of about 20 years that the consumer, it doesn't matter how many categories of consumers you think they are, but they all start off as novices or neophytes, whatever you want to call them, and then they either go on and they tend to come to a crossroads, and they aspire to get into wine. What we don't know is how long that apprenticeship is and what gets them to that point, and that's what we have to work on. And the problem is we put up this iconography, this picture of the connoisseur as being the ultimate aim. And for those of us who are bitten by the wine bug, we might have a Burgundy which blows our mind one day, and we just go, wow, and we spend the rest of our life, throwing good money after bad, just hoping to relive that experience. And, it's almost like a drug. It's this whole kind of, oh, wow, I got that cherry high thing and I want to get back to it again. And, but for those people who haven't had that, wine's just, it's just a beverage to share with friends. It's all part of the social experience. So, if we can get away from that kind of focus on every wine experience has to be the best that it can possibly be, then I think we'll start to get our head around the idea about what other reasons that people drink wine. It's not just about that peak hedonic experience. So, I think it's the sort of thing we really. I love the fact that, being from Australia, you tend to be far more egalitarian in your outlook in every element of life, and I really enjoy that. We don't have a lot of the protocols that you're expected to adhere to in Europe. So we've got the potential. I think it's just the desire at the top level to kind of recognise this is the way that we can encourage it and be more embracing, rather than sort of making it being disparaging if someone chooses a wine which just got a 13 out of 20 instead of a gold medal at the local wine show. That sort of thing is just becomes divisive, and we really should be avoiding that at all costs.
So I guess we both had that kind of experience of going through academic studies for wine business, wine marketing, but we came from slightly different backgrounds, because I had a bit of an academic background and then worked for a winery, whereas you were on the trade side of things. Did you find it difficult to kind of adjust into that academic side of the business?
Yes, and I'd say, to be honest, I'm probably still not the best adapted to the academic field. I have a tendency to be outspoken, which doesn't engender a lot of confidence and support in peers. But I also find that I love the knowledge, I love the philosophy, I love discussing things. Academics get a bad rap in that their work isn't practically applicable. And I mean, I heard the stories when I was thinking about getting into academia. I was still in Australia at this stage, and a lot of people in the trade were saying to me, I mean, there's that well-spoken phrase: "Those who can do, those who can't teach." And I'd had a lot of success.
Who can't teach
Those,
Jim.
yeah, exactly. And so it's such a shame that we just don't have that expectation or respect in Australia for what academics are doing. And I agree, a lot of them do things they don't do themselves justice, because the research they are working on may have no long-term practical element that practitioners can take on board. But quite frankly, I mean, in the wine sector in particular, I think there's a lot of research going on in the business side with limited funds, I might add. There's a lot of funds that go of the research funds, they go into viticulture and winemaking. Not a lot comes into the business side of things, and that's really business's fault, because we haven't done a lot to show that there are rules, there are outcomes that are clear and obvious. And when they are, we don't communicate them very well. We sit back and chastise the wine sector for not paying attention to what we're doing, instead of getting out there and saying, look, here are the sort of things that you can take on board. You apply these rules and they work. So without that funding, we're not really going to advance the interests of wine business. But for me, coming into the sector, it was a bit difficult, because I was very much a hands-on person. I'd had a number of experiences. I was very familiar with the concept of service and the value that it afforded any business in the wine sector. And I still to this day have desires to get back into the commercial sector, but there are just so many advantages in being involved in academia and seeing what changes I've been able to enact in a relatively short period of time, and what the future holds. And I'd like to be a part of that, because as I mentioned earlier, with the wine trade, I find being dominated by people who are far more interested in being wine experts rather than sociologists. It's really good if you actually have a program which says, look, let's just focus on the business. Let's look at the empirics of business practices. Let's look at what works as a selling tool. I mean, when do you rely on the use of awards as a way to get into a market? When do you rely on the use of a critical review as a way to improve your sales? When do you rely on journalistic coverage or advertising and those sorts of things? And we know how these things work. The problem is that most of the trade, and in particular producers, they don't know that information, and most of them just either don't have faith in it, or they just feel that they're better off spending money investing in barrels and hoping that the quality will get the wine sold. Whereas, I mean, we know that essentially there is very little relationship between an extra dollar invested into a new barrel and what that's going to end up being on the bottom line. So it's really the opportunity to make that change. I'm willing to kind of put my square peg into the round hole of academia and try and make a change. And I'm learning and getting better at it. But administration has never really been my forte. I'm far more interested in communication and education. So that's essentially where I have been able to fit my background and my experiences using cases as a way to teach, as an effective way to try and inspire and educate the new entrance into the wine sector.
Just coming back to what you're talking about as far as sort of industry support for academia, or in terms of research, as far as the wine market, wine business, and wine consumers, one of the biggest problems I think there is the fragmented nature of the wine industry in general. Whether it's in the old world where you've got thousands and thousands of producers who are all just kind of doing their thing, or in the new world where you've got some small producers who are doing their thing, and then you've got bigger brands who everyone sort of is self-serving in their own way. Like any kind of investment they're going to make is purely into their business. There's going to be a certain amount of community support and kind of wanting to improve the impression of wines from this region or from this country. But there's no kind of there's very little cooperation as far as let's all come together as a category. Wine needs to invest more in consumer behavior and how to connect and communication strategies, that kind of thing, in an effort to increase market share against our competitors, other alcoholic beverages or non-alcoholic beverages, that kind of thing. And so you would expect that larger organizations, whether it is, for example, the Champagne, the broad Champagne regional body, or whether it's more governmental, levies would be going towards that. But producers don't think, ironically, considering, they're planting vineyards which may not, be providing them with exceptional fruit for 15 or 20 years, or it takes them 3 or 4 years to convert to organic viticulture, that kind of thing. They're thinking a lot more short term and how you can actually make a living rather than investing into how to be better marketers at the end of the day. I think that's always going to be an issue and a challenge.
Yeah, the structure of the wine sector doesn't help its cause, particularly when you look at the raw numbers in Australia, for example. I mean, you look at the wine exported from Australia, 99% of the volume comes from 1% of the producers by number. So you've got 2,481 wine producers in Australia according to WineBiz Stats 2015. So basically, what you're saying is 24 of them, the 24 biggest producers, are pretty much responsible for getting all of that wine out into the export market. And we know from the double jeopardy law.
It's a bit like the 80-20 rule, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, except it's even more extreme than we could possibly imagine. Wine in that case, for that particular example, is far more a far greater difference in concentration than you could imagine in any other category. So, you've got this situation. We know from the double jeopardy rule that if you invest money into something, or if a market grows, the bigger brands benefit to a greater degree than the smaller ones. So, of course, an industry-based investment in business skills is by definition going to benefit the bigger producers more than the smaller ones. And that's in a standard market, with a market that's so much bigger like that. So of course you're going to have 2,457 of these wine producers, all these tiny producers who represent 1% of Australia's wine exports out there, volume of Australian wine exports out there, going, no way are we going to invest money into this sort of thing, because all of the money that we would put into it is basically going to go on to benefit the big producers. So why on earth would we do that? So it does make it a really big challenge. So the AGWA, I think it is now, under the new branding, they've got a big challenge in being able to show how they can come up with directions which are going to favour the small producers and get them involved. Because the big producers, not only do they benefit based on standard market principles, but the big producers often have their own marketing department as well. So they have people who are dedicated to this role. The small producer, they're struggling to make money. I think I saw recently the ABC report was saying that 70% of wine producers are unprofitable in Australia at the moment. So they're basically mainly your smaller producers, I'm going to assume. I didn't get into too much detail on that, but if you've got,
I think that was it was grape growers rather than wine producers.
Grape growers, okay, yeah, you're right. So you're talking about these guys who are struggling. They can't even make money. Why on earth are they going to invest money into a category where they're seeing a greater division of resources going to the top end of the market anyway? So it's when they can't make money, where could they come up with enough money to pay for someone to help them out with their business skills? It's just not available. So the wine sector either has to, if they rely on pure market economics alone, then there's going to be a huge clear out in the wine sector, and I don't think anyone wants that. But if they're not going to, and they're going to provide some support, they have to deliberately and actively look at ways that they can benefit the small producer, to give them some tools to help them get back in the game, but not doing it at the expense of the big producers, who are both stronger, independent, and they can lobby more effectively to be able to stop something like that happening. So we've got to we've got to go back to that Australian sense of mateship and say, look, how can we all help each other to grow the size of the pie, rather than just trying to beat each other over the head for bigger pieces of the same size market. So I think that's really the goal. The goal is to figure out how, as a sector, we can grow the pie to a greater degree and try and get a better division of resources down to the smaller size producer.
Geez, Damien, I don't know how long you've been in France for, but that certainly sounds a lot like socialism to me.
Yeah, it does. It does help us. But I mean, as I said, from a purely market. See, if I was a staunch capitalist, I'd just turn around and say, and playing devil's advocate here, I think one of the problems is Australia's number of wine producers grew from, according to what is it? Our stats. I'm trying to think of them. Not the ABS. At that stage, it was the Grape and Brandy Corporation. You're going back to the mid '80s. Yeah, going back to the mid '80s, there were 380 wine producers in Australia. Now there are, 2,500 or thereabouts, according to wine stats. I say according to wine stats because we've had this discussion recently online about how many producers there are, and the numbers seem to be, I seem to be underestimating how many producers there are. But if there were 380 odd back in the mid 1980s, and there are now, 2,500, that's like an almost eightfold increase. It hasn't been at the top end of the market. The same big producers that were around in the mid 80s are pretty much the same big producers now. Some of them have been rebadged, some of them have been consolidated, but they're pretty much the same group of people. So all the growth has come at the tiny end of the market. So we've basically got, an addition of more than 2,000 new small producers. And what does a small producer make? They don't make entry-level, novice drinking, appealing, simple, standard wine. They make wine for enthusiasts. Now, as I explained earlier on, that's not where the market growth has been. So the fault in the wine sector has been a focus on, we've had a huge increase in the number of tiny producers, which as a wine lover, I love. I reckon that's fantastic, but they're not sustainable, certainly not, and certainly not in the market, and they had no business plan. So they invested a lot of money to produce premium quality wine in a market where there was no growth, and so they're forced to drop their price. So the reason that they're uncompetitive is because they came in with the wrong product in the first place, whether I like the product or not. So, of course, as a staunch capitalist, I would say they came in with the wrong thing. They suffer the consequences. But as an Australian, and as someone who is a firm believer in giving everyone a fair go, I think we do need to look at ways of being able to keep those who are who can maintain a solvency in their business, keep them afloat. Whereas some of those who are just either not endorsing the image that is required of the Australian wine sector, or who are the least competitive, will probably just have to be left by the wayside. So, I'm aware that there are two ways to go in the equation. As a sympathiser, I'd like to see everyone get up. But as a capitalist, I'd like to say, well, we just need to have a what do you call it? We need to have a rationalisation of the wine sector, and that's not really going to make anyone happy, I wouldn't have thought.
Wine Darwinism, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very very good way of looking at it. So it's not an easy question to answer, James.
So how did you end up in France teaching in Dijon?
Well, that's probably an easier explanation. I think as anyone who is a wine lover, whether it's right or not is not the question. The fact is, as a wine lover, you look to France as sort of the reference. France is responsible for the world's greatest wines, and as I try to put in it as a disclaimer, whether that's right or not is not the question. It's the perception around the world. Chin Ma did this great cross national study in 2008, and it indicated that if you're a wine producing nation, most consumers in that nation tend to favour their own wines over anyone else's. But for the non-wine producing nations, they always look at French as being the best. And even for the wine producing nations, they almost always look at French as being the second best behind their own wines. So the perception is still there that French is the best, whether that's true or not. So when I came into the category, and
what's interesting is that even in large wine markets like United States or in United Kingdom, even though French wine might not represent the largest volume, it's still the perception that the French wine is the best.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Whereas in dollar per litre, I think New Zealand still got France aced in that level of the market as well. And New Zealand's very quietly smug little producer in the South Pacific going, people pay good money for our wines, and we've got our own problems, but we don't have to worry so much about the volumetric side of things because we've got a reputation as being premium producers.
Got to give them something.
Yeah, exactly. They're good like that. But for me, the appeal of France was like I could not understand as I was going through my studies. Wine consumption in France was still plummeting. It was going down, and this to me was absolutely amazing. How could the country that produces the best wine in the world be suffering to such an extent that their wine consumption had dropped almost 70% in a matter of about 20 years? So I mean that's a huge change in a short period of time. So I really wanted to be a part of that, and I thought if anyone could be involved in solving the riddle of why of what's happened in France, then really you've got the skills to be able to take on any challenge in the wine sector, and that's essentially what brought me here in the first place. I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to understand how it had happened, what went on, what the challenges were that any country suffering a dip would be facing. And after 9 years here, and starting off in the west of France, where I was in the Loire, I was in Angers for a couple of years before coming over to Burgundy. I've lived the experience of being a wine hedonist and being in Burgundy for almost 7 years, as well as being in a region which is more renowned for producing volume wines and struggling with the lack of awareness of their image and perception in the market. So it's been a brilliant experience. That's what brought me over here. I can tell you for sure, not only being an academic but also being in France, it certainly wasn't coming over here for the money.
Now, of course, you are Dr. Damien,
Yeah.
so I'm sure you have your PhD. What did you actually what was your thesis on?
The retrospective identification of wine consumption patterns. So what I did is I figured out a way to ask people over the history of their life to recall their patterns of consumption, and we did it across alcohol categories. It wasn't just wine; it was beer, spirits, and light and heavy beer and spirits as well. And we identified a way that people could recall their patterns of behaviour reliably and correlated them to the events that took place in people's lives to identify where those changes took place in people's lives, where they became wine drinkers, when they changed from category to another, and those sorts of things. And so it's kind of been part of my life's work in research to try and identify that process of adoption and changing from being someone who drinks wine to someone who constantly seeks the better wine event. Going from being an uninvolved to being an involved consumer. And so that's what my research has been on since then. So I started with Larry when I did my diploma, which became a degree, which became the first honours degree in wine marketing with the Uni of Adelaide as well, and then went to UniSA to do a master's in business, and then finished up with a PhD. So I worked concurrently throughout all my studies as well. I was constantly in, working at places like the Wine Underground in Adelaide, just to maintain a focus on both the premium end of the market and working in retail to get a feel for how people come into it and where they go. So I've tried my best to sort of get that.
At what point did you actually make the decision that? At what point did you make the decision that academia was the path you wanted to follow, rather than kind of focusing on the industry itself, like going back into the industry?
I think because as an educator, you've got the capacity to have interaction with a great number of people. And what I saw is that a lot of the influences in the wine sector were mainly the big companies, and the big companies often had their own vested interest. I mean, a good case in point is, say, the world's biggest wine retailer, Tesco. Their information is generally fairly well hidden. Their practices and how they've managed to get to that position is something that they guard very well. Whereas as an academic, you are both obliged and encouraged to exchange and to investigate different ways of learning and sharing information. So it's one of the things which got my interest. I felt that being on the side of the sector where you are encouraged to try and inform and educate over as many, as a wider part of the wine sector as possible, was a far more effective way potentially to be influential in trying to get the wine sector to change than it would be if I was a senior buyer at Woolworths or one of the other big producers who tend to be far better at guarding their information. So that's essentially it's more of an altruistic perspective, but it's also one of the things that I find really attractive is as an academic, if you can get your foot in the door, it tends to be a lot easier to have interactions with people. Whereas as soon as you take on a commercial interest, your network tends to close up. It becomes much more difficult to meet, to interact, to connect with them or with other people in the sector. And so, whilst I'm both enjoying and whilst I think there's still a lot more to learn in the different dynamics of the wine sectors around the world, I'm much happier sticking on this side of the panel. And so, essentially, that's what I'm going on to. I'm doing my best to try and bring leadership into education and to help encourage the future professionals in the wine sector to take on a perspective that's far more embracing rather than divisive.
And how do you approach the daunting task of educating future wine professionals as a wine business professor yourself?
In the 7 years that I've been running this wine business program in Burgundy, I have to tell you I've learned a few things, but one of the most challenging is that when you get new people coming into the wine sector, it is very difficult to get them to open their eyes and to accept new information when it challenges what they already know. And one of the challenges at higher education is you've got people with master's degree, at master's level. So they've either got honours degrees, or they've been studying for a long period of time, or they're coming in with some professional experience. And as individuals, we are driven by our own experiences. We don't tend to accept those of others because we use our own lens to reflect on how other people behave. And so what we tend to find is that people who come into the wine sector at this level, they've had such experience in and with other people professionally in the wine sector that's what drives their opinions on wine. So when you present people to these new students statistics that suggest that things like the screw cap is not the devil incarnate, or that wine consumers love yellowtail, or these sorts of things, they are very quick to dismiss that as an exception because they've never come across that before, because of the people they talk to, who are usually the icons, the enthusiasts, the other professionals in the wine sector, tell them otherwise. So when you've got such you've got a group of intelligent individuals who have been fashioned in a way that has formed them to believe that their focus should be on, the brilliance and the wonder and the diversity of wine that is available. Telling them a story that, yes, that's important, but it's such a tiny portion of it. You have to look at the commercial relevance. You have to look at the market dynamics. You have to look at processes of growth in markets and those sorts of things. They're very quick to dismiss them because they've got examples of where businesses have been successful taking another path. And as you said before, the wine sector is so fragmented. Because it's easy enough to find an example of where you can be an enthusiast and you can be an expert and you can just focus on fine wines and you can be successful, well, it's very easy to dismiss the fact that most of the wine sector doesn't run that way. Sorry, educating. Sorry, James. I was just saying that educating those students and trying to get them to recognize that they have to be able to separate their own perspective and their own interests, which they can keep, but they've got to be able to make money by looking at the interests of the sector in general. That's getting that balance right and getting them to both accept and buy into that strategy is probably the biggest challenge I'm facing.
I guess I was somewhat fortunate in my experience when I went back and did the postgraduate studies, that I hadn't had that real kind of hardcore wine background. I started off working just in a Liquorland store, and then I went to a medium-sized, well-regarded brand winery, which wasn't considered to be very commercial, but wasn't kind of part of the elite, and therefore when I came into the academic or the wine business studies, I had a pretty open-minded, without even being aware of it at the time, I think, because I met my fellow students, and a lot of them had been in the industry, pretty much the same amount of time as I had, but who had completely different experiences. And when we were doing sensory evaluation components of our studies, and like tasting wines, looking at wines, particularly blind, I was just completely out of my depth. I had such little experience with imported wines, for example, or I had a very parochial kind of a cellar palate, really, and so that kind of allowed me to come with a much more blank slate, I guess, to then kind of look at it, and so that makes me, I guess, a little bit more accepting of the industry in general. Whereas, a lot of my wine friends, industry friends, kind of do look down on that other side of the business, which, I don't necessarily, I'm not connected to it, but I accept that it is a part of it, a very important part of wine, because you'd never have a wine market if people weren't being introduced to wine at that lower end.
Yeah, I've taken on quite a different approach. I used to be a lot more of an evangelist for wanting to get people to adjust their mentality, but I'm actually a much better listener these days, and I think that's probably made me a better educator as well, because you tend to find, just from what you're saying, I still get those those discussions, and instead of actively trying to get out there and changing people's opinions, it's very difficult. You can't argue with someone's opinion. You can argue facts, but opinion is another matter altogether. And so when I tend to listen a lot more and try and look for opportunities to get people to reflect on their own perspective, rather than sort of saying to them, "Did you know the evidence is contrary to what you believe?" Because even if you've got facts on your side, when you've got these sorts of discussions usually take place in a crowd of wine enthusiasts. And even if you've got facts on your side, you can present to people, well, here's the counterpoint. When the people you're saying that to are surrounded by others who agree with their personal opinion, it's very difficult to get people to see another way, even if you've got facts basing it up. And I've found that with education as well. The French tend to have they're far more focused on the chalk and talk approach of education, and believe that unless students are in the classroom listening to lecturers, they're not learning as much. So you spend a lot more time face to face with students in this part of the world than I would in Australia. And you can talk to people individually who might be receptive to the idea that students should be more should be given more independence, should be encouraged to do things outside of the classroom, should be encouraged to reflect and discuss. But as soon as you get people in a group, that whole individual belief and openness disappears out the window behind the group mentality that it's all about getting a lot of focus in class. And so, it's changing opinions of the masses is really, really difficult. You can't do it independently. It's one thing being a maverick, but you've got to have that critical mass of people supporting it, and they've got to be influential people who support the view before people start changing their own perspective. And so, now I've got to the stage where there have been enough graduates coming out of this program who are taking on a different approach, who are starting to, they're progressing very quickly through their jobs in their careers. They're getting good jobs. They're getting asked for jobs. And I've got other students from other programs who'll contact me and say, I can't find a job. I've just found this opportunity where I can do an internship in Germany where I don't get paid and I'll be there for 6 months. Should I take it? That I can really see that difference now. So I'm starting to believe more strongly in the approach that's being taken, but I need more advocates out there on the ground who are backing up the idea that we need to change our perspective, because it's very difficult. Because being a wine expert and enthusiast, and being regarded well amongst your peers, I appreciate the satisfaction that people get from that. It's a hard thing to fight against. But getting people to be, we've got to have the wine interests, the wine sector's interests at heart here, and by creating more wine enthusiasts is going the wrong way about it. So slowly but surely, James, if I can get enough people on side, the message will change, and the system, the Titanic was very slow in turning, as they say, and so we tend to find that as soon as you break enough
Rome wasn't built in one day.
No, exactly. So it just takes time. So it's I'm 7 years into the journey at the moment of having some degree of influence, and that I'm hoping that by the time I get to 10, I'll be able to actually see and measure a bit of the change that's taking place.
Excellent. Well, That sounds like quite a daunting but very important task that you are continuing to endeavour with. And I do appreciate you, like I said, making some time to be on the Vincast and introduce your perspective to the listeners. So thank you very much.
Oh, no problems at all, James. Always happy to help out, and look forward to following the Vincast and the stories that come into it in the weeks, months, and years to come. So, you come back and see me in 3 years' time. We'll see what happens.
And if people want to follow you and sort of find out what you're up to and where you are, what's the best way for them to do that? On social media?
I'm very active on social media, but I tend to stick to three different interfaces. And play around a little bit with others and nuances as they come up. And that's my LinkedIn profile, which has a number associated with it. So just look up Damien Wilson on LinkedIn, and you should be able to find the wine business professor in Burgundy. I tweet more frequently than ever at wine biz prof, and that's wine BUS as in short for business. I really probably should have made that BIZ, but I didn't. Wine Biz Prof, and also on Facebook, I have a professional profile that's attached to the School of Wine and Spirits Business in Burgundy.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to catching up with you somewhere in the world at some point in the future.
Yeah, well, with some luck, I might be back for AWITC again in 2016. That's in Adelaide, and I'll make a point of coming through Melbourne, James. And if you're still there, you can find that cafe in North Melbourne. I'll grab you a coffee.
Thanks, Damien. And thank you very much, guys, for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Guestbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Intrepid Wino, and follow the podcast on Twitter at the Vincast. Facebook.com/Intrepid Wino is my Facebook page. And come to intrepidwino.com to listen to every episode of the Vincast, as well as read some of my writings and tasting notes. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or even Player FM. And when you do that, please do rate and review the podcast. Share your thoughts, which episodes you liked, which guests you enjoyed listening to, and any ideas you may have to improve the podcast. Remember to get in contact via thevincast@gmail.com if you would like to be part of the 50th episode, and you can ask me any questions you might want answered. But until next time, bye.